U.S. B-52 bombers conducted a training mission over Finland, simulating weapons drops alongside Finnish.
Tensions in the Middle East aren't just simmering anymore, they're boiling over. And when a storm brews in this region, the whole world watches. But this time, the warning didn't come as a press release or a peace talk. It came as a deep rumble across the sky. The United States just flexed hard, dozens of B-52 Stratofortress bombers roaring into the skies over the Middle East at full throttle. These are iconic for their long-range power and unmistakable growl. And this sudden deployment didn't go unnoticed, especially not by the Houthis, who now find themselves scrambling for cover and answers. So what exactly happened? Why now? And more importantly, what message is Washington really sending? Let's unpack the first act of this unfolding geopolitical thriller. The rumble begins. This wasn't a typical military exercise. It wasn't just another patrol in contested airspace. What unfolded above the Middle East was a deliberate high-stakes maneuver. More than a show of force, it was a calculated strategic signal aimed directly at the northern highlands of Yemen and the echo chambers of Tehran. The United States sent a fleet of B-52 bombers soaring across the region, aircraft capable of carrying 70,000 pounds of weaponry each. These weren't stealthy flybys or symbolic flyovers. These were loud, forceful, and unmistakably real. They cut through the sky with purpose, transforming the quiet unease of the region into something closer to alarm. It was a message that spoke louder than any diplomatic warning or official condemnation ever could. The United States had just shifted gears. For the Houthi fighters, who in recent months have grown bolder in their offensives against commercial shipping lanes and US allies, this wasn't background noise. It was the sound of a new reality coming for them. In command centers tucked away in Yemen's rough terrain, intelligence officers stared at radar screens that suddenly lit up with unmistakable signatures. There was no mistaking the approach. These weren't surveillance drones or fighter patrols. These were the real deal. Satellites confirmed it. Intercepts confirmed it. Ground chatter rose as the unmistakable drone of heavy bombers rolled in over the desert and mountain passes. Tension replaced confidence. You can read about B-52s in training manuals or intelligence briefings, but watching them streak across your sky at low altitude is another thing entirely. And for many in those command posts, it was the first time the distant threat of American air power had ever felt so immediate. This move wasn't about muscle flexing for headlines. It was the opening act of something far bigger. The operation underway, known as Operation Rough Rider, is not just a mission. It's a full-scale, coordinated effort designed to dismantle the Houthis' operational capabilities piece by piece. Launched in March 2025, it marks one of the most aggressive and far-reaching campaigns by US forces in the region in recent memory. The objective is clear: strip the Houthis of their ability to function as an organized Iranian-backed threat. The Pentagon isn't looking to contain them. It wants to unravel the very systems that make them dangerous. That means going after the nerve centers of Houthi power, radar systems that give early warning of incoming strikes, air defense batteries that could repel jets and drones, and, perhaps most critically, the launch infrastructure used to fire missiles and drones into international waters or neighboring nations. These aren't symbolic targets. They're the backbone of the Houthis' offensive capabilities. By disrupting or destroying them, the US is aiming to neutralize a threat that has long operated under a cloak of geographic advantage and regional ambiguity. For months, Houthi attacks on Red Sea commercial routes have strained international shipping and drawn increasing attention from global security analysts. Each strike tested international patience. Each escalation forced neighboring powers to consider more serious interventions. With Operation Rough Rider, the US has effectively declared that those red lines have been crossed. It's no longer about waiting for the next strike. It's about making sure there's no capability left to carry one out. Now, with B-52s entering the scene, it's not just about hitting targets. It's about psychological dominance. These aircraft are symbols. massive, slow-moving in the sky, but unstoppable in intent. They're strategic bombers with global reach, often used when the US wants to send an unmistakable, terrifying message. Escalation won't be tolerated. The choice of the B-52 was theatrical, and the Houthis weren't ready for the show. Of course, the Houthis aren't alone in this. They're one of several regional proxies backed by Iran. And when US bombers thunder overhead, it's not just the fighters on the ground who take notice, it's the people pulling strings behind the curtain too. Iran's leadership, already facing international pressure and economic isolation, wasn't expecting this level of escalation so soon. They had warned neighboring countries not to cooperate with the United States, hinting at unpleasant consequences if they did. But that didn't stop US aircraft from being cleared through friendly skies. Tehran found itself cornered, its deterrence crumbling and its proxies under direct attack. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps held emergency meetings, trying to recalibrate their next move. Do they respond? Do they pull back? Or do they gamble, hoping the US won't go beyond airstrikes? Whatever the answer, it's clear that the balance of power in the region has tilted, at least for now. Every move in the Middle East sends ripples across the globe. The B-52 deployment isn't just about Yemen or even Iran. It's about the broader chessboard, stretching from the Gulf to the Mediterranean, from Israel to Iraq and beyond. Allies of the US have applauded the decisive action, quietly or otherwise. Meanwhile, rivals are reassessing their game plans. Russia and China, both with increasing footprints in the region, are watching closely. For them, this is more than a headline. It's data, it's intel, and it's strategy. The US just moved a powerful piece across the board. Now, everyone else has to rethink their next play. Genesis of Operation Rough Rider. In the early hours of March 15, 2025, long before sunrise, the still skies above Yemen were ripped apart by the distant, thunderous echoes of American aircraft engines. What seemed like an ordinary quiet night quickly turned into the opening act of a massive military campaign. The United States, under Operation Rough Rider, launched a fierce and coordinated strike against the Iran-aligned Houthi rebels, one of the boldest moves in recent Middle Eastern conflicts. This wasn't just a reaction, it was a build-up of months of provocation. The Houthis had been escalating their attacks on commercial shipping lanes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, playing a dangerous game that threatened global maritime trade. Oil tankers, cargo freighters, and even humanitarian aid vessels had been caught in the crossfire of an insurgency that had grown too confident and too provocative. These waters were international lifelines. America had seen enough, and this operation was meant to make that very clear. No subtle diplomacy, just full-throttle force. The US administration positioned this mission as more than a military strike. It was a message to Iran and its network of proxies. Through Operation Rough Rider, Washington wasn't just targeting the Houthis, it was attempting to redraw the lines of influence in the region. They were roaring through jet engines, missile trails, and explosions that lit up the Yemeni night like fireworks designed by a defense contractor. From the beginning, Operation Rough Rider had one job: disrupt the Houthi war machine. And the tools chosen for that job were anything but subtle. The US deployed its heavyweights, B-52 Stratofortress bombers, advanced fighter jets, and guided cruise missiles launched from warships stationed across the Gulf. These weren't hit-and-run tactics. This was a symphony of synchronized firepower played on a battlefield that had grown far too familiar with chaos. The B-52s, in particular, stood out as the loudest part of the orchestra. Massive, intimidating, and capable of flying across continents without stopping, these bombers were tasked with dismantling the core infrastructure that gave the Houthis their bite. Precision airstrikes focused on radar systems, drone launching pads, missile warehouses, and command centers. Each target was selected after days, sometimes weeks, of intelligence gathering. Satellites tracked vehicles, drones loitered over compounds, And once the button was pushed, there was no turning back. But air power alone wasn't enough. US Navy vessels stationed off the coast added their own flair, firing off Tomahawk cruise missiles with chilling accuracy. Together, the air and sea campaign unfolded like a carefully choreographed assault. Every strike had a purpose: to blind the Houthis, break their communication, and stop them from pressing another launch button. In the background, intelligence agencies and military analysts watched every explosion, every radar ping, every intercepted signal. This wasn't a one-night stand. This was a sustained show of dominance, and the US military wanted to ensure the Houthis understood the weight behind every impact. The opening strikes achieved what they set out to do: send the Houthi chain of command into disarray. Communication lines broke down. Local commanders scrambled to reposition. Key depots, filled with Iranian-supplied missiles, went up in flames, one after another. By morning, Yemeni news outlets were flooded with footage of charred bunkers, twisted metal, and stunned fighters surveying what remained of their facilities. The damage wasn't just physical, it was psychological. For months, the Houthis had been operating with a sense of impunity, launching attacks and then disappearing into the shadows. This time, those shadows weren't safe. Satellite-guided bombs had found them. As a result, several planned operations on the Houthi side were halted, some indefinitely. American officials hinted that the attack had also interfered with the group's attempts to expand their drone warfare program. Launch pads hidden in mountainous regions, once protected by camouflage and weather conditions, were suddenly rendered useless. Fighter groups scattered, unsure if their next step would be under the watchful eyes of an unmanned aerial vehicle circling overhead. Though this was largely a US-led operation, the scope extended beyond American command. Intelligence was shared across the board, with Gulf allies, NATO intelligence partners, and even back-channel regional players who had their own scores to settle with the Houthis. Joint drills and contingency plans that had been years in the making were finally tested in real time. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, with long-standing animosity towards the Houthi rebels, stood quietly in the wings, supporting in whatever ways possible without drawing too much attention. After all, a full-on regional conflict was the last thing anyone wanted, but a message still had to be sent. At the same time, American bases in Djibouti and Qatar were buzzing with activity. This wasn't just a mission launched from one point and executed blindly. It was a networked operation where multiple nodes worked together, funneling data, monitoring feedback, adjusting strike patterns, all in a matter of seconds. This, if anything, was a real-time case study in modern warfare. Gone were the days of slow, lumbering strategies. Operation Rough Rider moved with surgical precision, designed to shock and disable before the enemy could even react. As with any modern military campaign, especially one carried out in densely populated areas, the question of civilian impact became a pressing one. Despite efforts to limit collateral damage, reports began surfacing of civilian injuries, disrupted infrastructure, and widespread fear among Yemen's already war-weary population. International watchdogs voiced concerns, and humanitarian organizations called for restraint. Civilians, already living in fragile conditions due to years of conflict, now faced blackouts, water shortages, and displacement as airstrikes hit nearby military zones. The US insisted it was striking only legitimate targets, but the fog of war made it nearly impossible to verify every claim. Meanwhile, Iran condemned the operation outright, framing it as Western aggression and a continuation of imperialist intervention. In turn, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria began issuing veiled threats, hinting at possible retaliatory strikes on American interests elsewhere in the region. The geopolitical temperature was rising, and Operation Rough Rider was at the center of the storm. One thing was clear: Operation Rough Rider wasn't cheap. The Pentagon reportedly burned through nearly $200 million in precision-guided munitions within just the first 3 weeks of the campaign. And that's not even factoring in fuel, logistics, satellite surveillance, or the personnel deployed across bases. It was a heavy price tag for a mission whose endgame was still unclear. Still, officials stood firm in their messaging. The strikes were necessary. The Houthis had gone too far, and if the cost of maintaining freedom of navigation in the world's busiest trade routes was a few $100 million and a fleet of bombers, then so be it. What matters now is how far the US is willing to go to keep that control, and whether the Houthis, bloodied but not entirely broken, will respond with a fight or finally retreat. The OG war machine that refuses to retire. When the world saw the B-52 Stratofortress soaring through the skies over the Middle East again, many did a double take. After all, this is a plane that first took flight back in the 1950s, when the Cold War was just heating up. Fast forward over 70 years, and this metal beast is not only still around, it's out here flying at full speed, wrecking strategic targets like it just clocked in for another day at the office. Nicknamed the Big Ugly Fat Fellow by air crews, the B-52 isn't pretty. But it doesn't have to be. Its whole aesthetic screams function over fashion. It's a long-range, heavy-duty, strategic bomber designed to do one thing well: carry a ridiculous amount of explosive death across continents and drop it with surgical precision. In this operation against the Houthis, the B-52 didn't just show up. It dominated the skies like a senior employee walking back into the office to fix everything that's gone sideways since retirement. At first glance, sending a plane from the 1950s to a 2025 battlefield feels like showing up to a tech war with a floppy disk. But this isn't your granddad's bomber anymore. The B-52 has undergone so many upgrades over the decades that it's basically a vintage body housing modern warfare tech. Think of it as an old Nokia phone, but with an iPhone brain, and the ability to flatten an entire compound in a single pass. With new radar systems, advanced avionics, GPS-guided weaponry, and the capacity to stay airborne for nearly 20 hours with mid-air refueling, the B-52 remains a terrifying asset in any theatre of war. And in this case, it was more than symbolic. The aircraft's presence over Yemen screamed, "We've been here before, and we're not done yet." In the latest operation, these bombers weren't acting alone. They flew in tight coordination with surveillance drones, AWACS aircraft and fighter escorts, creating a deadly air net over the Houthis. Once locked in, the B-52s rained down joint direct attack munitions and other precision bombs that wiped out key military assets in a matter of minutes. Houthi targets that took years to build disappeared in under 30 seconds. That's the B-52 signature. Heavy payloads, delivered fast and without mercy. Speed matters, especially when you're trying to send a message that can't be misinterpreted. When dozens of B-52s were seen flying at full speed across the skies, it wasn't just about military logistics, it was psychological warfare. Flying a bomber like this at top throttle across the region is a bit like slamming the door open when you walk into a tense meeting. It's not subtle, but it gets everyone's attention. The US wasn't trying to sneak up. It wanted the Houthis, and everyone backing them, to look up and feel the weight of what was coming. Satellite imagery picked up the movement. Regional radars tracked the aircraft. Even civilian social media accounts caught shaky footage of massive planes flying in formation. The internet did the rest. Within hours, B-52 memes were trending in defense circles and regional newsrooms alike. Every roar of a B-52 engine overhead was a not-so-gentle reminder that America could bring the pain from halfway across the globe if it needed to. There's a reason why, even with 5th-gen stealth fighters and drones, the US still drags the B-52 out of its hangar like an old but trusted hammer. It's a platform, not just a plane. One that can be endlessly customized to fit the mission at hand. When it comes to dropping conventional bombs, this bomber has it covered. It can launch cruise missiles from hundreds of miles away, carry smart bombs, electronic warfare pods, or even nuclear payloads, though thankfully not in this case. The best part is that the bomber doesn't need to enter contested airspace. It can hit targets while chilling in international skies. sipping jet fuel and minding its own business. It's the introvert of aerial warfare, distant, quiet, but deadly when provoked. In this latest round of Middle Eastern tension, the B-52 also helped reduce the need for boots on the ground. With its precision-guided payloads and long-range capabilities, ground forces didn't have to engage unless absolutely necessary. Fewer troops at risk, more air dominance, a strategic win from the Pentagon's point of view. The psychological effect on the enemy. From a tactical standpoint, the bombs did the damage, but from a psychological perspective, it was the sound of the B-52s that broke morale first. Fighters on the ground could hear the approach long before the payloads dropped. The low-frequency rumble was like a prelude to destruction. Houthi fighters reportedly scrambled for cover even before alarms were raised. Some compounds were abandoned entirely once the aircraft were spotted on radar. There's a legacy effect here too. These bombers have been in service through Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Yemen. Their presence alone invokes a kind of generational dread. Commanders in the field know what follows after the roar. Fire, chaos, and silence. The Houthis, no strangers to air raids, had never quite faced a storm like this one. Makeshift shelters didn't stand a chance. Communication posts melted away. Radar units were gone before they could lock on. The psychological pressure mounted. And the strategic fallout was immediate. Delays in Houthi planning, radio silence across some networks, and a cautious shift in their aggression levels. Getting a fleet of B-52s into action isn't like launching a couple of drones from a desert airstrip. It's a logistical ballet. Tanker aircraft have to refuel them mid-air. Radar coverage needs to be established. Coordination with allied bases and regional air traffic controllers becomes non-negotiable. When the US decides to mobilize its strategic bombers, it's not just a mission, it's a movement. In this operation, the aircraft likely flew in from US bases in the Indian Ocean and parts of Europe, possibly Diego Garcia or RAF Fairford. Hours of flight time, thousands of gallons of fuel, and dozens of support crew coordinating every flight. But that's the thing about the US Air Force. It's built to scale. When it wants to move mountains, it brings machines that can crush them. Meanwhile, adversaries across the region watched and took notes. Iran, already wary of America's strategic air power, saw its proxy in Yemen battered with precision and speed. Other groups linked to Iranian influence likely reviewed their own vulnerabilities, because if B-52s could target Houthis this accurately, they knew they weren't off limits either. And perhaps the most mind-boggling part of all this? The B-52 deployed over Yemen aren't even the final form of this aircraft. The US military is already working on upgraded versions with new engines, better fuel efficiency, and even more advanced targeting systems. These future versions are expected to fly well into the 2050. So while shiny new stealth jets get all the attention, the Stratofortress keeps rolling up its sleeves and getting the job done. In the age of drones and AI, there's still room for an old-school war machine that flies like a bus but hits like a freight train. The Gulf powers react. When the B-52s tore through the skies, it wasn't just the Houthis who were rattled. In capitals like Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Manama, leaders weren't exactly popping champagne, but their security councils sure breathed a little easier. For years, Gulf states have tiptoed around the growing threat posed by Iran's proxies in the region, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen. And while these states have beefed up their own air defenses and even launched their own military campaigns, like Saudi Arabia's long, frustrating intervention in Yemen, there's always been an unspoken understanding when the heat really rises. Privately, Gulf strategists are loving the B-52 deployment. It's a high-profile message that the US hasn't completely checked out of Middle Eastern affairs, despite whispers that Washington's heart has moved on to China, AI, and TikTok policy. For the UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's a win. It shows that when the regional security vacuum gets too loud, America's old-school deterrence doctrine still hits differently. But this isn't 2003 anymore. the public reaction is quieter. Gulf leaders have grown smarter about optics. There's no giddy cheering on state news channels. Instead, there's a diplomatic poker face. Official statements loaded with words like stability, dialogue, and restraint. Behind closed doors, however, military briefings are on fire with excitement, and air defense teams are feeding radar footage through AI systems to analyze just how efficient those US strike patterns were. Because if the B-52s are back, so is the possibility of getting their own hands on upgraded support systems and intelligence. If there's a state in the Middle East that treats American aircraft like unsolicited guests at a wedding, it's Iran. Tehran didn't exactly send out invitations to the B-52s, and it sure as hell didn't appreciate the RSVP coming in the form of airstrikes next door. The Houthis may operate from Yemen, but Iran sees them as more than just allies. They're pawns in a longer game of regional chess. The moment the B-52 footage surfaced, Iranian military commanders were already sharpening their press releases. Their official line: accusations of aggression, imperialism, and flagrant violations of sovereignty. All classic greatest hits from Iran's political playlist. State-controlled media looped old clips of past US failures in the region. But make no mistake, behind the smoke of their public condemnations, Iranian brass is spooked. The speed, scale, and precision of the B-52 deployment sends an uncomfortable message. The US still has the muscle memory to strike hard and fast, and it hasn't gone rusty just yet. Iran has spent years investing in asymmetrical warfare, proxies, drones, cyber attacks. But these bombers aren't playing the same game. They're from a different rulebook, one where firepower speaks louder than indirect messaging. In Tehran, military analysts are running postmortems on Houthi positions lost. Iranian IRGC operatives embedded with the Houthis are likely sending encrypted feedback up the chain. How the airstrikes bypassed defenses, how the radar arrays went blind, how the bunkers weren't safe enough. For Iran, this is a data collection moment wrapped in mild humiliation. Iran's influence faces stress testing. One of Iran's core regional strategies has always been about expanding its influence without direct confrontation. That's why the proxy network exists. But every now and then, when a proxy takes a hit this hard, it shakes the entire tree. After the B-52 raids, chatter picked up among Hezbollah contacts in Lebanon and Iraqi militias. The Houthis, once seen as untouchable under Iran's protective umbrella, had just been steamrolled. That doesn't inspire confidence. If anything, it creates a ripple effect of doubt. If the US can go this hard in Yemen, what's stopping them from doing the same in Baghdad, Beirut, or even Damascus? Even worse for Iran. These doubts aren't just being whispered in tents and underground bunkers. They're spreading across encrypted apps, military forums, and quiet diplomatic channels. Iranian-backed militias are suddenly reviewing fallback positions, rotating key personnel, and relocating sensitive equipment. Some are even issuing silent stand-down orders, not because they fear immediate US action, but because the illusion of immunity just cracked. Iran, known for its long-game patience, now finds itself in reactive mode. That's a weird position for a country that usually loves slow-burn chaos. The chessboard just got a little more unpredictable. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, intelligence analysts are practically munching popcorn while tracking every development. For Israel, the Houthis are a regional menace, especially after missile launches that have occasionally threatened its borders. But more than that, Israel views this entire episode through the lens of its eternal frenemy, Iran. If the US operation weakened Iranian influence even by 5%, that's a win for Israel's regional strategy. Not only does it reduce direct threats, but it also adds more pressure to Tehran, which Israel has been countering through covert ops, air raids in Syria, and international lobbying. The B-52 strikes do what Israeli jets can't always get away with: massive, overt destruction without diplomatic fallout. Plus, Israel knows how to read Washington's body language. The moment the US sends bombers, that's a signal that gloves are off. It's the kind of move that boosts Israeli confidence in mutual defense understandings, especially as it eyes other powder kegs like Hezbollah in the north and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. While war rooms across the Middle East analyze missile paths and casualty numbers, the region's business elite has a different concern: energy. The Gulf lives off oil, and nothing rattles markets faster than military aircraft zipping over oil shipping lanes. The B-52 presence triggered a minor spike in oil futures, not because supply chains were directly hit, but because traders knew one wrong missile could set off a chain reaction. The Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, two choke points near Yemen, are essential arteries for global energy. And now, bombers are flying near both. In Dubai and Kuwait City, investment firms are holding late-night strategy calls. In Riyadh, energy ministers are quietly discussing contingency plans. If tensions escalate and Iran decides to lash out, perhaps with Houthi-supplied attacks on tankers, insurance premiums on oil shipments could skyrocket and prices could spiral. The B-52 deployment was supposed to restore balance, but it's also a reminder of how fragile that balance really is. The B-52 bombers didn't just fly in for a demonstration, they came with a purpose. Targets were carefully selected: Houthi-controlled weapon storage facilities, air defense systems, and training camps. These were about cutting down the group's operational capacity and morale. The precision of the airstrikes left large chunks of Houthi infrastructure in ruins, severely limiting their ability to launch coordinated attacks. And the message was clear: mess with the wrong powers, and the consequences will be swift. While the Houthis are known for their resilience and ability to regroup under fire, the scale and intensity of these bombings have forced them to rethink their strategies. Supply lines have been interrupted, critical weapon caches destroyed, and their ability to quickly launch missile strikes has been hampered. For a group whose power relies heavily on surprise and irregular tactics, this hits hard. The immediate aftermath of the bombings saw chaos within Houthi leadership. Known for their tight control over military operations, the leadership structure was strained as they scrambled to assess the damage. The Houthis, who once prided themselves on a network of underground bunkers and dispersed equipment, found that even their most hardened positions were vulnerable to modern warfare. Houthi commanders, who had previously been unflinching in their anti-US rhetoric, were now seen in internal meetings, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left. For the rank-and-file Houthi fighters, the psychological impact was equally significant. Being accustomed to a war of attrition, many were unprepared for the sudden devastation. Morale dropped as the realization set in. They were up against a military force that could strike from unimaginable distances, bypassing their defenses with ease. This shift in mindset could have long-term effects, potentially leading to defections or a disillusioned front. Alright, so that's it for this video, and if you want to watch more amazing content like this, check out some of our other videos. Bye.